All right, my friends, Final Fantasy XVI. About Final Fantasy XVI. I have been playing this game for over a year. I am a slow gamer. That's why my backlog is pretty big, because I get distracted by other games and have a number of games on the burner that I played a little bit of. And eventually I get back to them. Part of the reason for the RPG backlog, to kind of compel myself to go backwards and play the games that I've purchased in the past and have in my backlog, to find and squeeze some enjoyment out of things that I've started and fallen off for some reason. Final Fantasy XVI is so interesting to me because the demo, I think, is perhaps the best demo of a game that I've ever played. And I remember the buzz around that demo when it came out, I think in May or June of 2023. The hour and a half or so, it's like the beginning of the game where you are a young Clive protecting your brother Joshua as he's moving towards awakening his icon, his dominant, the Phoenix. And the story contained in that demo was so engaging that I picked it up, checked out the demo, sort of on a whim. I wasn't the hugest Final Fantasy fan. Certainly, the dev on Prof and ProfPlaysGames played a ton of Final Fantasy. I played very little. I played Final Fantasy 15 as my first Final Fantasy, which should tell you enough about my experience with Final Fantasy. Since then, really this year has been the year of Final Fantasy for me. Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Final Fantasy 12 this year, and now finishing Final Fantasy 16. Certainly have the itch for Final Fantasy now, but then I didn't. But I picked up the demo because the buzz was, boy, this is like dark fantasy, Game of Thrones, kind of rich, deep, thick, dark story. So I checked out the demo because it was free, obviously, and see how it plays, see what it looked like. Wanted to be part of the conversation on the sister podcast, Prof and ProfPlaysGames, and my lord, it hooked me so quickly. The tutorial wasn't that long. There was a battle sequence where you're kind of sparring with your, whatever, weapons master. But it quickly accelerates to, if I remember correctly, Joshua trying to awaken his icon and shit going south, and the icon Bahamut coming in and fucking killing Joshua, killing the Phoenix. And that the icon Ifrit is Clive, the main character, Joshua's brother. But I think at that time we didn't know that Clive knew that. So it ends with brother killing brother, basically. And brother stories are interesting to me. I have a strained relationship with my brother, so I'm not as touched by brother stories unless they're fucking fighting and battling and fucking each other up. That I can connect to. Loving brother stories, I certainly cannot. And by the end of the game, we get to a loving brother story, but at the beginning it was not. And it was well paced and just right from the beginning, fucking hard rock, really, just like a really hard-edged Final Fantasy, something different than I've seen in Final Fantasy, or at least thought I had seen before, which was, obviously turn-based, and this was action combat, real-time action combat. The Devil May Cry battle or combat lead was on this, and it was very different. You could attach rings to yourself to do some auto combos or auto dodge. I think there's a ring that did something else as well. And that was kind of the difficulty scaling in the game, where you attach these rings to modify the difficulty for yourself to kind of push through the combat and such. And certainly I think there are also difficulty modes. I think there's a story mode and normal mode. And when you beat the game, there is a Final Fantasy mode, which is more hardcore. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, the demo sold me on Final Fantasy 16, and I purchased the full game immediately. Played when it released, probably for, I don't know, a good 10 hours or so, and started to peter out around last September or so. I play games pretty slowly anyways. I get to start playing games late at night when the family's asleep, usually around this time. It's 9:25 right now at night. So around 9:30 to 11 is kind of a game time. And for the most part, my impression of Final Fantasy 16 was lots of cutscenes. I think if you go to YouTube, the amount of cutscenes equals something like 20 to 24 hours, which is really about half the game. So there's just so much cutscene. It's like watching a movie in some ways for some parts of it. Scenes that go on for 10 minutes or longer even. Late at night when I'm tired, not doing anything interactive, just like that, I start to fall asleep. So I really couldn't get through the game because I was just falling asleep. So I moved on to other games and, came back to Final Fantasy every once in a while. If you go to the Prof and Dev Play Games YouTube channel, you'll see my Final Fantasy 16 No Commentary series, and you can just check the dates and you can chart my progress temporally and see how long it took me, where I started, where I sputtered, where I came back. And I came back with a vengeance in the last probably month, a little less than a month. In the interim, I played Final Fantasy VII Remake, played a lot of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, played Final Fantasy XII, as I said, and we're starting up a new run. We're doing Final Fantasy, the original, on this podcast feed soon. So, lots of Final Fantasy in between playing Final Fantasy 16 and coming back to it. To the last third, really, it's just a fucking sings. The story is coming together. Excuse me. The depth of the characters is coming through. You're starting to get more connection between Clive and his party mates, Joshua, his brother, Jill, who as a youth was his ward, sort of like Theon Greyjoy, if you're familiar with Game of Thrones, except not Theon, meaning not turning into a fucking asshole. Later in the story, Jill was cool through and through. There's a scene later. Obviously, this spoilers for the whole fucking game here, folks. If you're listening to this podcast, this is sort of my impromptu Final Fantasy 16 review, as it works. I finished the game 2 days ago. There's a scene, probably 2/3 of the way, a little more than that, 4/5 of the way through the game, where Clive and Jill are back to back naked on a beach after this big battle. And it's the first time where they're really getting close. And it's just like, I think it was Andy Cortez from the Kind of Funny podcast was like, this relationship between Clive, the main character, and Jill, a party member who's always AI controlled, you never control them, is the longest slow burn of a relationship in video games that he's ever seen. And when he articulated it like that, that exactly said what I had been feeling and hadn't been able to articulate. I was curious if there was going to be a love interest, if there was going to be some sort of romance, because they played it so distant. Like, they worked together, they were friends. Obviously, they'd known each other for a long time. These characters, Clive and Jill, but there wasn't like a ton of like overt spark. It was very, very under the surface simmering. And when we get to that scene where they're naked, back to back, just talking like friends, and then Jill turns around and hugs him and holds him, it's a beautiful scene. It's like, so, what's the right word for that? Fulfilling, satisfying, I think is the word, where you're like, they finally are getting together, and I assume they smoosh. We don't see that, of course. It fades to black beforehand, but yeah, I mean, two people who are that close on the beach sharing, deep feelings about what's been going on, it leaves your imagination to wander. which is really what this game does at the end too. We get to the end of the game where Clive and Joshua go to the Sky Fortress Origin to battle the ultimate big bad, Ultima, who basically represents himself as a god or the god. So again, a Japanese role-playing game where you are fucking killing God by the end of it. In that battle, there's so much, which I'll talk about in a moment. But at the end, when Clive perseveres, he ends up on a beach looking at a moon that he's sharing with Jill, who's somewhere else looking at the same moon. It's a really tender, sweet moment. And Clive's hand is turning to stone from a consequence of the magic that's killing him. But we don't see him die. We don't know if he dies. Maybe he goes back to Jill. Jill is looking at the same moon and sees a red star flash and then burn out and die. And you wonder, is it the fulfillment of Clive's wish to come back to her? Or is it Clive burning out and dying? We don't know. The story ends and does not tell you, and the DLC is in some ways coterminous with events earlier in the story, so they are not something that follows the end of the game. So we don't know. It's left to your imagination. Same thing with Jill and Clive's relationship earlier, although I think it's pretty clear, at least to me. But certainly you could just say they were on the beach naked and hugging and hanging out and not getting down and into it. But certainly I believe they did. But the end of the game is less clear for me. Did Clive die? Is Clive still alive? I don't know. But I think the point was, and Ben Starr gave an interview later where he said the point was the ambiguity. It's up to the viewer, like the person consuming the art. What do you think? And I don't know. I want to believe sort of like Rogue One, like Star Wars movie. I don't like Star Wars very much. I don't find it very interesting. I also don't like sci-fi that much. But Rogue One was so great because besides being well written and a good movie, ends and it ends. There will be no sequel. There will be no Rogue One Part 2 because those characters are dead. And there's something about that where the story is its own little capsule. Final Fantasy is an anthology series, and it's its own capsule. Each entry is its own capsule, and they're fairly disconnected. I know there's some that are in Ivalice. Ivalice is Final Fantasy XII. Ivalice is Final Fantasy Tactics, if I recall. But they're not connected. Same thing about Final Fantasy VII. There is some thought that Final Fantasy X is in the same universe as 7. Who knows? I like that. Same thing as Legend of Zelda, right? Each thing is its own thing, even though Legend of Zelda is like the same characters, where Final Fantasy is not. Still that over time, each entry is different. So in this one, we don't need, and we'll never get, a Final Fantasy XVI Part 2 like we did with Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels. And that's okay. It's nice to see these characters, these rich characters, be developed and end with a story. And I wonder, I think this year, let's see here. Yeah, May of 2024, Square Enix, business report. The president of Square Enix talks about Final Fantasy XVI not meeting long-term sales expectations. And Square is just fucking famous for having sales expectations that are just bonkers dumb, too high. Did that for a long time with Tomb Raider, and they spun that off and got rid of Crystal Dynamics and whatever else. But Final Fantasy XVI, based on what I'm looking at on Wikipedia, second best-selling game behind Diablo 4. Its first week, it sold 3 million units, which mini games would kill for. But certainly the production of Final Fantasy XVI starting in 2015 and releasing in 2023 is 8 years. Just, it's a lot of fucking money. So $3 million maybe doesn't recoup costs. Recently, Final Fantasy XVI released on Steam. It was only released on PS5. So there certainly is the thought that console exclusivity, especially when consoles, the current gen consoles, are not selling as well, or that's not true, not selling as well, but the adoption rate is slower in terms of install base at this point for Final Fantasy 16, which was a PS5 only game. I could see a world where it sold, imagine it sold it released at the end of the PS4 life cycle. Boy, I think that would have sold gangbusters. And maybe if it did, we would have a Final Fantasy 16 2, or maybe not. Yoshi P was the producer on this game. Yoshi P is famous for his work on Final Fantasy 14 and helping bring that out of the fucking dirt and turn that into a MMO that is just, taking the world by storm, really giving World of Warcraft a run for its money. But, it didn't get a sequel. It got DLC that explored another icon, Leviathan. I haven't checked out the DLC yet, but it continues Clive's story. Not continues. Gives more about Clive's story with Jill during the events of the main game. So, deep, rich story, doesn't get a sequel. It's okay to enjoy it on its own. It was a 2023 release in July, I believe. And it was nominated for the Game Awards for Best Narrative. It was nominated for Best Performance, who's Ben Starr, who's now in, the new game that is coming out next year from a French studio who has turn-based combat, looks sort of Persona-ish, but really nicely fantasy. His name I just am trying to pull by vamping. I cannot remember the name right now. Maybe I'll remember it later. But he's in that. He's a great voice actor, I gotta say. He was also nominated for Best Role-Playing Game, but against Baldur's Gate 3, good fucking luck. Also, the controversy around Final Fantasy 16 is it an RPG? Certainly you level up. There is an aspect of changing gear to get better stats. It's muted, but it's there. There's no dialogue choices. You're not building a story or a character in that way. You're not building a character. There's no character creator, et cetera, et cetera. So is it an RPG? Is it not? For the purposes of this podcast, it's here. So I think of it as an RPG. But I determine or define role-playing game quite loosely. I'm playing a role, and you kind of do that in every video game. But the stats increase, the equipment swapping in and out, and the rich story lend me to say, yeah, it's an RPG. Why not? Also, it's Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is traditionally RPG. Yeah, they changed some of the mechanics. Certainly, you're not doing turn-based combat or choosing attacks in a menu sort of way, but you do. If you don't have the ring on to do auto combos, you're choosing which icons and which attacks to focus on, and you are, it's not in the menu, but you are choosing through the series of button presses which attack you want to do when, which icon you want to use, and you're kind of juggling those attacks, sort of on cooldowns in a way that Diablo might be, where you're hitting an attack and then it's got a cooldown and you're juggling all those different abilities. But there's certainly no stat tree. You're not upgrading any sort of stat tree. You are doing some crafting to increase your items and such, your weapons and armor and whatever else. Yeah. So those are the awards from the Game Awards. It won only Best Score and Music, which fucking well deserved. That score is amazing. The music is great. It's stuck in my head constantly. At the Golden Joysticks, it won Best Audio, which I can see. The really does sound good. Best Lead Performer was Ben Starr, and he won there. But Best Supporting Performer, Ralph Ineson, he was in Diablo 4 as Lorath. He's in here as the first Cid. Cid's with you for the first third of the game, and then he dies quite spectacularly. And he knew he was going to die. He sacrificed himself mostly. Voice acting, the character Cid. I mean, Cid's a reoccurring character, of course, a reoccurring motif in Final Fantasy. As you have an anthology series, you have reoccurring Chocobo, reoccurring crystals, reoccurring Cid. This Cid was something special. The performance that Ralph Ineson put together for Cid for this game, I'll never forget. It's incredible. I can't believe he didn't win Best Supporting Performer. I guess in 2023, he was up against the Baldur's Gate 3 crew, so good fucking luck. But man, his voice, his delivery, that Cid character, maybe partially because he flamed out so early, is so memorable. But I would have loved to have him along the ride with me, man. But Cid dies. You have a 5-year time skip, and then you're back with Clive as the leader of the Outlaws, leader of the Hideaway, taking the moniker Cid, which is pretty cool. You become Cid, and you try to honor Cid's legacy by going across the world of Valisthea, the continents of Ash and Storm, and just breaking these mother crystals, breaking them to smithereens, because magic, in your view, is destroying the world, and the mother crystals give the magic. I believe later in the story, it turns out the mother crystals were basically sucking the ether out of the world and sending it toward Ultima, who's the final boss, voiced by Harry Lloyd, who was an antagonist in Game of Thrones. He was Daenerys' brother, whose name is escaping me at this moment for some reason. So he's just an incredible voice actor, great actor in general, and a theater actor. Just the performances overall in this game, we were fucking stellar. The writing, crisp, really engaging, well written from top to bottom. Not overwritten. Koji Fox was involved in the writing. I think it was written in Japanese, and then it was translated to English and localized, not just translated. This whole fucking controversy about translating games and keeping things in exactly how they were. People miss the point of what interpretation is versus translation. So localization is interpretation, taking the text, interpreting it into the new culture, right? It's written in Japanese. It's steeped in Japanese culture. It gets interpreted into, whatever Spanish culture, American culture, French culture, wherever it is fucking localized into. But this was interesting because the localization happened, and then they recorded the voice lines, and then they went back and matched the Japanese to the English lip flap, basically, which is hard to do. So I imagine, and I believe, the Japanese script changed going back. So dreamed up in Japanese, interpreted into English, and then backwards interpreted into Japanese to match the lip flaps. It's pretty interesting. So the writing was very, very good for me. The plot takes you through several cycles of deep, dark political machinations, starting with, Joshua trying to unlock his icon, it going fucking sideways. Clive's father dying during that sequence, during that ceremony when they're ambushed by soldiers from a neighboring area. When his father dies, Joshua's icon awakens, the phoenix starts doing damage, and then all of a sudden another icon, Ifrit, emerges and kills the phoenix. Kills the phoenix, and then Clive is just fucking furious because his mother... of his mother or his stepmother? No, it's his mother, if I recall correctly, set up the ambush. So her dad's died. His dad's dead because of her. And then Clive gets enslaved by his mother because Clive doesn't have the magic, basically. It doesn't have the blessing. So we fast forward 13 years after that demo, after the intro section, and Clive is part of an army between the Dalmekian Republic and the Iron Kingdom. And they're sent in to assassinate the dominant of the icon there. And the dominant ends up being Jill. And Jill was the ward who was part of Joshua and Clive's family, basically, kind of like Theon Greyjoy was to the Starks. He frees Jill, and then Sid comes and rescues them, and Sid is the one who decides to help Clive search for the dominant of Ifrit. And at that time, we know it's fucking Clive himself. He's searching for the dominant. He's the dominant. So you know he's going to find out he's the one who killed Joshua. And when he finds out, he is a mess. But Sid convinces him to keep figuring out what's really going on here. During this whole process, he battles someone named Benedicta and takes her icon, which is Garuda. And he provokes Clive once he has Garuda, and he turns into Ifrit and kills Benedicta. That's something that's going to come into play later because he fights someone else's dominant, the dominant of Titan, the icon Titan, Hugo. Hugo loved Benedicta. So Benedicta wants to just fucking murder Clive and tries. But Clive kills Hugo and destroys that mother crystal. Later, there is some machinations in a different kingdom whose name I can't recall, but there's a character named Dion who is the son of a man who is now married to Annabella, which was Clive's mother. And she's doing her thing again, her evil shit again. And Dion is chafing against it. And because of all that drama, Annabella basically dethrones Dion as the kind of lord in waiting and instead chooses, I believe it was Dion's brother, Olivier. During this whole scene, we see that Dion is gay. Dion has a relationship with his, I guess, male footman or male squire. I'm not sure. We see them kissing at one point. And I read, and I'm not sure, I can't believe this is true, but maybe it is. This is the first openly LGBTQIA plus character in Square Enix games, or main character, or supporting character. I don't know. I can't remember exactly what, but it led to this game being banned in Saudi Arabia because of the gay relationship between these two men, which is fine. You know, every culture has their own stuff. So to the crowd who's so up in arms about people changing fucking what's in the original Japanese because it's too offensive to a culture. Yeah, first of all, that's not a thing. Localization and interpretation are different than translation. But look at what happened here. Saudi Arabia said, get rid of that character, get rid of that scene and those, that theme, LGBTQIA plus theme, gay theme, and you can sell in Saudi Arabia. And Square Enix is like, fuck you. We're not taking it out. We just won't sell it there. So next time someone tells you interpreters, translators, localization is making games less of what they were in the original text, there's an example that you can tell them to fuck off with. Yeah, feel a certain way about that. So in the end, Ultima dies, and in the battle with Ultima, Clive, in different sections, draws on each icon and remembers each dominant. He takes Shiva, which is the dominant, or Jill's the dominant of. So he takes Jill's power. He ends up taking Joshua's power, even though he doesn't want to. Every, Sid gives him, I forget what Sid's power was. It wasn't Bahamut, it was something else. But he takes Sid's power as well. And then as you're doing that battle, you hear lines from them, and it's just perfect. It's really, really great to have those characters come in and be with him, at least in spirit, as he's battling Ultima, who is this godlike antagonist who sort of revels in being alone. So you sort of have aloneness, being alone, contrasted with, no, you're in this together with other people. And let's see what wins out in the end. In this case, it was the togetherness. It was being in a group of people committed to a similar cause. Clive defeats Ultima. Clive and his spiritual party defeat Ultima, and Ultima's defeated. And perhaps Clive dies. It's up to the interpretation of the player. So that's Final Fantasy XVI in a nutshell. Nutshell? What the fuck is a nutshell? That's Final Fantasy XVI in a nutsack. Well, that's also wrong. That's Final Fantasy XVI in a nutshell. An amazing game. A strong contender for a wonderful Final Fantasy game that, because it has a different combat system, it's not turn-based, it's not exactly what fans were expecting. It was in some way derided, but it was critically well received. OpenCritic gave it, I think, a 92. Incredibly well received. And there are fans who think who say it's one of their favorite Final Fantasy games. I'm one of those fans, even though I haven't played a ton of Final Fantasies. I've played several. And this one lasts, even though it's a slow burn after that introduction section. There's a lot of movie to watch, a lot of cutscenes. But it is deep, dark. It is also full of hope. It is about free will and how humans, we're imperfect. Yeah, we fuck up. Yeah, we fall down, but we get back up. And that's us. We keep going. It is a special game. Final Fantasy 15, I said, was the first one I ever played. I loved it. I played it to completion, but boy, was it fucking broken. It was open world, then it was closed toward the end. The bro trip was awesome. The camping and getting to know each other was awesome. I thought the combat was pretty good. It mixed up action with menu-based. But man, this really dives into the story. This gives you a story, honestly, a very memorable Final Fantasy story. So yeah, overall, really, really liked it. Super recommend it. I think that if you are struggling through it in some of the same ways that I've mentioned in this podcast, stick with it, because by the end, it is fucking firing on all cylinders. Music, visuals, gameplay, story. It's fantastic. So that's Final Fantasy 16. Thanks for hanging out with me while I talk to myself about this wonderful game and memorialize how I feel about it. Looking forward to digging into the DLC soon. If you like our podcast, please rate it on your podcast service of choice. And we'll be back next week with something else, surely. Also, check out the main feed, Prof and Dev Play Games. We are there every Monday talking about the week's gaming news. All right, folks. See you next time.